one of the first things we need to talk about is when we say God, what are we talking about? Now, when we talk about God, we're going to talk about God from the traditions of the West, that being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All these religions are what we call Semitic religions. They're all considered religions that grew out of Judaism. And so they all share a concept of God that is very similar. They all believe, and just sort of give you a little bit of a history of these three religions. Judaism was basically a tribal religion developed in the Middle East, or Israel area, Egypt, that kind of area, North Africa, Middle East is a sufficient descriptor, and it held this idea that there was this creator God, and that was quite a bit different than the other religions of the Eastern tradition. In the Eastern tradition, the God is not so much a creator. It's God God just kind of comes along. There's a powerful being, there's a force, but there's no real need to have a creation story. And the creation story is something somewhat unique to the Western tradition. So Judaism comes along and comes up with this creation story. And so one of the first attributes we have is that God is a creator. And then the other attribute is that God is one, that God is sort of a central force, that it's not just that there's spirituality or there's a force within us or a chi or something like that. Instead, God is sort of this one being that is the beginner, the creator, and the most powerful entity in existence. So God is one and God is creator are two of the first attributes. Well, then Judaism always had a belief that there would be a messianic figure who would come along. They believed that they were a chosen people, a tribe, and that God would eventually send a messianic figure to deliver them from their their problems. God will eventually return, and He has chosen them. Well, the Christians believe that Jesus is that messianic figure, and so they obviously grow out of that tradition. Islam also grows out of the same tradition, but they believe that Muhammad comes along and that he is a prophet of God, but they also believe Jesus is a prophet of God. But they also believe that their tradition began when, if any of you recall, and some of you don't, but Abraham and his wife were having some trouble getting pregnant is a Old Testament story, or a story from the I think it's in Genesis, and so it's part of the Torah or whatever in the Jewish tradition, and they're having trouble having a baby, and she's actually quite old, and so Sarah says, "Well, why don't you go and have relations with my maid, my assistant, and when you guys have a baby, we'll then raise it as our own." And so Abraham's like, okay, and he goes and he gets her maid or whatever pregnant, Hagar. Well, then a little bit later, Sarah ends up getting pregnant, and so she's not real fond of the fact that he's got this child with this other woman, and so he says, "Go kill him, get rid of him," and this is sort of seen as acceptable. And so he takes them out into the middle of the desert and basically leaves them for dead. Well, the story is that God provides for Hagar in the desert in the Islamic tradition, that she takes his heel and rubs it against the sand, and when she does that, a spring of water wells up, and they are able to drink. And then birds and everything bring them food, and they're able to eat, and they continue to live, and they go on. And when her son Ishmael grows up, he ends up having 12 children, and those 12 children become sort of the 12 tribes of Islam, or the 12 tribes of Ishmael. At the same time, Abraham and Sarah have a child, and they have 12 kids. Their son Isaac ends up having 12 kids, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that is sort of very similar in nature, the idea that there are 12 children, that they're the descendant of God, or this promised offspring, and they both sort of take roots in that same tradition, that same story. So that's basically how they all share roots. They all believe in the same basic concept. The other concepts is, so there are 5 attributes that God has in these traditions. It's one, God is one, that there's not multiple gods. This would be true in, like, for example, Judaism, there's a belief that there is the God, the most powerful God. Christianity has an idea of one God. But, most clearly is Islam, they have their very name for God as Allah, and Allah really just means the one God. It means one God. And so the name literally means one God. And so all of those follow in that pursuit. They also believe in a creator. They all share that creation story. But then the others are that God's omnipotent. Omnipotent, you have this word omni, O-M-N-I, O-M-N-I, and that means all, or wholly, all or completely. And so, omni, all, and potent. Potent is something like strength. You get the words like potential, means, there's something hidden within an inner power. But then you can also say, like, something smells bad, you'll say, oh, that's potent, right? And that would be making a statement about, something being strong in odor. And so what happens is omnipotent means all-powerful. And the idea here is God can do anything God so desires. God can do anything God wants to do. If God wants to, heal you of your illness, God can do that. God has all the power to do that. If God wants to build a building that's 1,000,000 stories tall, God can do that. If God wants to take the earth and go and make it disappear, God can do that. God has the power to do anything. Now, within that attribute, we always talk about the fact that there are some limitations to that omnipotence, that we don't just accept that God can do anything, that God can't be required to do anything that's logically contradictory. And by logically contradictory, the idea here is you can't say, well, can God build a rock so big that God cannot lift it? Well, no, because if God can make a rock so big that God cannot lift it, then God would have the power to build the rock, but God wouldn't have the power to lift it. And that causes a logical contradiction. If God can build a rock big enough that God can lift it, then God has the power to lift any rock, but God doesn't have the ability to build a rock big enough that God can't lift it. And so that is what they would consider logically inconsistent or logically contradictory. And basically the only rule, and one thing that philosophers of religion will do is they'll sit around talking about that, is they will say God is all-powerful, but God cannot be forced to do something that is logically contradictory. The next attribute is omniscient. Once again, you have that omni, which means all, and then you have the scient, S-C-I-E-N-T. Well, if you look at that, S-C-I-E-N-T, if you take off the T and put on C-E, you get science. And science is basically shares the same etymological roots as this. And science is basically a word in Greek for knowledge. And so it means all-knowing. It's a form of all-knowing. And so the idea here is God knows everything. Now, this becomes an attribute that gets under a lot of debate, because one of the problems with God knowing everything is the question of, well, if God knows everything, does God know what I'm going to do before I do it? For example, as people know people better, oftentimes they can predict what they're going to say. Like, think about an old married couple, and, to a certain degree, like, they can finish each other's sentences because they know that when this happens, that husband of theirs is going to make this joke, or that, he's going to say this, he's going to say it this way, and he's going to do this, he's going to do it that way. And so there's almost a foreknowledge. And so does God know what we're going to do before we do it? And if God knows what we're going to do before we do it, then do we have free will to not do it? Right? I mean, if somebody already knows, and to know something is to not just have an idea that you're going to do it, but to actually have an idea and it be true. If God has actual knowledge of what we're going to do before we do it, then are we truly free to do anything else? And so that's one of the issues is, does God have divine foreknowledge? And does divine foreknowledge limit or prevent us from having the ability to make free choices? Then there's omnibenevolence, or what we might call all good. Benevolent, you might see begin with, bene is a word from, that a lot of languages use. It means good, but, you can see words like in Spanish, there's the word bien, and in French, there's bon, and all those mean good. And they look very similar. They're etymologically, they share similar roots. And the idea there is that God is all good. All these words mean good, and so benevolent means good. And so if somebody's benevolent, means they're good. They give. People oftentimes think about like police benevolence funds or a benevolent fund, and it's just a charity that does good. And so that's where that word comes from. So the idea here is God is all good, and the idea of all goodness is God can do. God is basically not malicious. God is not bad. God is all good. God only has good thoughts, good desires, good deeds. That everything God is positive. It's not negative. And so those are the main attributes. One, creator, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent.